Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the Road to Reformation Part 2 in our continuing study of a history of Christianity. In our timeline, notice we've seen the East-West Schism, that was back in 1054, and then the period of the Crusades spanning roughly about 100 years. And then we saw what we call the Babylonian captivity of the church. That was when the Pope moved to Avignon. Didn't feel like a captivity to him, but for now about 70 years, we have popes not there in Rome, but instead in Avignon in southern France. They're enjoying themselves there. And then finally, when we do have a new pope that comes back to Rome, the French decide they don't like that, and so they elect their own pope. So we have this period of the Great Schism where we have not one but two popes, and eventually there's even three popes. So the church is in a state of somewhat disrepair and disrepute over all of this. And yet we should not imagine that there were no bright spots along the way. And so we look at Julian of Norwich. She, while very ill as a young girl, she had had a series of visions that she took to be visions of Jesus. And she wrote about these in her Revelations of Divine Love, describing the visions, describing this message that she felt she had had from God. And she has herself walled into an anchorage. Now, an anchorage needs some explanation here. They would take perhaps what we would think of as a small closet on the edge of the church, and instead of having a door into the closet, they would, once she went in, they would wall her in, where they would block it up, and there would be only a series of very narrow windows looking to the outside. And one of these windows would be into the church itself, so that from her little anchorage, from her little closet, she could see and hear the church services being done inside the church. And then another of these windows would look to the outside, so that there on the street, again, she could see people passing by, just a tiny glimpse, because it would be a very, very narrow window. And she could maybe speak to them, and they could speak to her. And then a third window to her servants' quarters, because after all, if she's walled into this little room, she can never go in or out. And that means if she's going to eat, that a servant will have to pass her food. And then after she's eaten, when she has to take care of bathroom facilities, all that has to be passed out to the servant. And so she's in this narrow little area, walled in here for a number of years. Now, this wasn't the only time that sort of thing happened. It wasn't for punishment. This was in order that she might actually pour her life into the very life of the church. She would become part of the church, anchored within it, hence the term anchorage. Here's a quote from her book. She says, "I am sure that no man asks mercy and grace with sincerity without mercy and grace being given to him first." And I think that's good, although remember, that's not too far from what Thomas Aquinas had said, that God first gives mercy, and then we respond. And of course, Aquinas went ahead to say, and we respond, and therefore earn that next step of grace and mercy, so it really doesn't become grace and mercy. Julian doesn't say that. I like to think, I don't know if it's true, I like to think that maybe her theology was a step better than that of Aquinas. We also have from this period Thomas à Kempis. He lives in the Netherlands, and he becomes both a priest and a scribe. And his writing is still a bestseller even today. His writing is known as the Imitations of Christ. It's devotional literature, and he himself reflects this because he lives a quiet and reflective life and calls for Christians to do that. And it doesn't say everybody has to do it just like him, but that's what he has chosen to do. Here's actually the beginning of his book, page 1, chapter 1, verse 1. "I would rather feel contrition than know how to define it." Now, when we looked at Thomas Aquinas, the great theologian, he's all about defining these terms. But à Kempis says, "I'd rather feel contrition than know how to define it. For what would it profit us to know the whole Bible by heart and the principles of all the philosophers if we live without grace and the love of God?" And I think he's onto something. That yes, it's good to know these things, but it's much better, it's much more valuable to live these things. He says a little bit further on, Lord God, and notice a good deal of his book, part of his book he's talking to his audience, and for parts of his book, his audience becomes the Lord. So he's actually praying to the Lord. Lord God, my holy lover, when you come into my heart, all that is within me will rejoice. You are my glory and the exaltation of my heart. You are my hope and refuge in the day of my tribulation. And so in the same way we take the Psalms and can read the Psalms and even pray the Psalms, I think that we can take the book by Thomas the Kempis and read it and even pray some of his prayers. Next, we look at, and we saw John Wycliffe in a previous lecture, but now we look at his spiritual, I'm going to call him his spiritual son. Actually, they had a bit of a connection because Hus is actually going to get some of the writings of Wycliffe and will be influenced by them. His name, John Hus, there are some people that are so poor they don't actually have a last name, and John was one of those. He had been born and raised in the town of Hus. The word Hus just means goose, so we could say he's from Goosetown. He lived in Bohemia, what is today the Czech Republic. He becomes a priest and then a lecturer in the University of Prague. So he is a learned man, and he becomes also the rector of the Bethlehem Chapel. We would call him the chaplain to the college and to the students there. As I said before, he was influenced by the writings and the teachings of John Wycliffe. And remember that all writings at this point, the printing press had not been invented yet. So anything that is being written and passed on is being hand copied. And he gets some of these hand copies, and he is so impressed. It changes his outlook. Teachings, for example, that the Bible is to be the basis of our doctrines. And to us, that's so obvious. But that wasn't obvious in the day and in the age in which Hus lived. That only God forgives sins. And of course, this is standing up against the Roman Catholic teaching, both then and now, against indulgences. And this was something that the church could not tolerate. He speaks out about the Eucharist, that is the Lord's Supper. And of course, the way they were doing the Lord's Supper at that point was that you would partake of the bread, but not the wine. Only the priest had the wine. Now, he is called to the Council of Constance. Now, the Council of Constance was being held because of that three-pope controversy. Remember, you'd had two popes, and then they had said, well, let's appoint a third one. We'll negate the other two, but the other two didn't want to be negated. So now we've ended up with three popes, and so the Council of Constance is called for that primary reason. But it's also going to be something that pulls in Hus. So you have a number of VIPs there, very important people. Sigismund, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and Wenceslaus, the king of Bohemia. Everybody who's anyone from that part of the world is there. And Hus is called to attend, and he is given a safe conduct pass so that he will be allowed to come and present, and then the idea with the safe conduct pass, then he will be sent home safely and everything should be okay. However, when he arrives at the council, he is early on arrested and thrown into jail, prison, some sort of holding facility that is not very sanitary, not very capable as to its climactic conditions. Remember that it gets cold in that part of the world. And so he is held there for a series of months, and his health certainly declines during that period. At the end of that time, he's brought forth, and instead of allowing him to defend his teachings, he is just asked, are you going to repudiate anything you've written, anything you've said? And don't give us any comment, don't give us any conversation, just yes or no. And he chooses to stand by what he has written. After all, he has said such things like, well, the Bible is the Word of God, and we should follow the Bible. And that God forgives sins. These are things right out of the biblical text. And for this, he will be condemned. You say, well, he had a safe conduct pass, and the church says we don't honor safe conduct passes with heretics. So it's to the stake he will go. He will be burned at the stake. It's probably an apocryphal statement, but many years later, it's reported. I think these words maybe were put into his mouth. I'm not sure that he said these at the time. And yet, because it's later on attributed to him, I think it bears repeating. It is thus that you silence the goose. And remember, that's a play on his name because he's John Hus, John the Goose, from Goosetown. It is thus that you silence the goose, but 100 years hence there will arise a swan whose singing you shall not be able to silence. And it was right about 100 years later, not in 1415, but in 1517, that we're going to have Martin Luther nail his 95 Theses on the wall of Wittenberg Castle. However, as Huss is put to death, that doesn't mean the movement that he had begun is going to end. Instead, it receives a life of its own. There were written protests over his treatment. After all, it was claimed he had a safe conduct pass that was not honored. Sigismund actually threatens to drown all Wycliffites and Hussites, and so the battle lines are drawn, and it will lead to some fighting. There is a revolt in Bohemia where the representatives of the king are thrown out the window of the castle. Unfortunately, they're up on the second or third floor. They have quite a fall. The good news is where they land is where they'd been tossing out all of the other garbage, the sewage droppings and things like that. So that softened their fall, and they were embarrassed and maybe a little stinky, but did not die from it. Now, this revolt involves a number of parties. There's not really a lot of unity among the parties since Huss was not there to be the leader. And so you have the Utraquists, those who felt that at the Lord's Supper they ought to have the bread and the wine, not just one, not just the bread. There were also some radical groups, such as the Taborites, who announced the arrival of the millennium. The kingdom has now started right here in Bohemia. Let's get on with it. Of course, I think they were in error, at least in that area. There now begin a series of anti-Hussite crusades that will try to douse the flames, but will not completely succeed in extinguishing them. Next, we have, meanwhile, in the West, but it will spill over into these, so it will take up these causes as well. The 100 Years' War is going to be between England and France. What happened is you'd had the death of the King of France, and he hadn't left any heirs. So who's going to be the next king? And they began looking to see who was qualified. And there was a Frenchman who was in the family line, but there was also the King of England who had sort of married. Now it wasn't directly, but it was through his mother. And in England, that was enough. Royalty flowed through the English mother, but the French didn't see it this way. And so you have England versus. This was what sparks off the war. It won't be continual war for 100 years, but it's on again, off again, on again, so that by hindsight we look at it and we say, yes, roughly about 100 years, you have this war going on between England and France. This was a time where a new weapon, and it's always interesting to see new technology. And in this case, it was the longbow, the British longbow, which was able to, because of the length of the bow, the weight of the arrow, it had a good solid arrow, and it could be launched with such a force and a speed that it could penetrate armor. And of course, armor was only worn by the knights. You had to be fairly wealthy to be able to afford a suit of armor. And yet here, a longbow that could be wielded by, a peasant or a farmer, as long as he could shoot straight, suddenly a peasant or a farmer can take down a knight. Well, that's most democratic and not very, very sporting, at least in the opinion of the French. but this is going to mean that the English will be winning battle after battle. Now, ultimately, I suppose you could say they lost the war, because at the end of the story, you're still going to have a French king in France and a British king in Britain. But it will go very positively for the British during this war. One of the other outcomes of this, because normally you would only collect taxes in time of war. You needed taxes to pay the army. The rest of the time you could sort of make by on other means of income. And that means that by the time we've come to the end of this war, taxation has become rather normative. And also you have grown what we can think of as nation states. That is, there's not just a clan here and a clan ruling over there, but now we can talk about the nation, for example, of England and the nation of France, and we're beginning to see other nations as well. In France, this is also the period where we have Joan of Arc, this young girl who, as a teenager, claims to have had visions from one of the saints, telling her that if the French will follow her, then they will win at least several battles, and the Daphne, the one who is, we would call him the crown prince. He's not been crowned king yet. He says, sure, what have we got to lose? And he endorses her, and she leads the army, and they actually do have some victories. So the English are driven from France, but then after this, she is betrayed into the hands of the English, who take her and burn her at the stake. In 1453, we see the fall of Constantinople, and that is a huge event because the city of Constantinople had stood as the bastion and center of the Roman Empire. You thought, well, wait a minute, I thought the Roman Empire ended back in 476 AD. No, it had only moved east. Constantinople now had been the capital of the Roman Empire for the last 1,000 years. And after 1,000 years, the Constantinople finally falls, and now falls all of the Roman Empire, not just the part in the west that had fallen earlier. And it is overrun, and now there is nothing to halt the westward spread of the Muslims, who are now pivoted to rush into Eastern and Central Europe. About the same time, we have Gutenberg with his invention, the printing press, and one of the first things that he prints is a Bible. The first complete book is the Bible. Gutenberg had the key to his invention is that he's using movable type, and there's only 26 letters in the English alphabet, and same thing with the German alphabet. They have a few extra little signs and things like that. But as far as the letters are concerned, you can actually get by with 26 letters and just a few little things like periods and quotation marks and additional items like that, which means that once you have put the letters together, you can change them and print page after page after page. And so instead of a book perhaps taking an entire year to write, to hand copy, and then you've got one copy of one book, now in a matter of days or perhaps weeks, you can print not one, but 100 books. And so suddenly the printing of books has been a revolution. Now, Gutenberg, they didn't have patents back then, and so Gutenberg wanted to have the monopoly on printing books. Perhaps if he had paid his workers a little bit better, he might have been able to keep the process a secret, but instead, within just a few short years, you begin having printing presses spring up all over Europe, and they didn't have patent protection back then, so he really isn't going to benefit from his invention. We have Gutenberg's printing press. Now, we don't know the exact date. I usually say around 1452, but that can move up or down, and we said Constantinople falls in the year 1454. I'm sorry, 1453. So we have the fall of Constantinople. Martin Luther is already, he's going to be 15, 17 when he will be nailing his thesis on the door of Wittenberg Castle. So we're getting very close to the Reformation. But before we get to him, we want to talk about one last pre-reformer. Now, some things that have been developing as we get to, and the one we're going to talk about in a moment is Savonarola, but there was a growing anti-clericalism that made it possible for Savonarola, and I think ultimately Martin Luther, to come about. Some views about the clerics and about the priests, some anti-church thoughts that were beginning to spring up. First of all, because the clerics, the priests and bishops and anybody involved in the church, anyone who made their living by the church, came under certain exemptions. They were exempt from secular law. They could commit a crime. They were not judged by the local jurisdiction, by the local judges. They were only judged under the church jury, which could be overly lenient on their behalf. They were exempt from secular taxation. They were exempt from civic duties. All these exemptions mounted up. Not only that, but people had to pay their tithe. Now, in many churches today, there are churches that endorse the idea of tithing, and they want their people to tithe, but nobody's going to come and actually take it from your wallet if you do not do it. It's something that you do because you wish to. In that day and age, it was a requirement. It was part of your taxes, and so even today in a number of countries, I remember when my older brother was going to Germany, and they asked him, "Well, what are you, Catholic or are you Lutheran?" And he said, "Well, neither one." And he said, "Well, then you must be an atheist." Well, no, I'm not an atheist either. And there was a check mark. Well, to whom do you want your tithe to go? Because they were going to take it right out of his taxes. I don't know if they're still doing that. I haven't checked up on it lately. But you also had clerics, bishops in particular, holding multiple church offices, because once you bought your way into a church office, and that was going on, we'll look at that next. Once you bought your way into a church office, you could skim the profits of those tithes, and by holding an office in 3 or 4 or 5 churches, there was that much more money coming in, even if you never set foot in that church. And so there was a general lack of holy living, where somebody would become a bishop or a monk, and that didn't change their lifestyle at all, because they were in it in order to collect the money, in order to have a nice living. You might have a bishop who had, on the outside at least, renounced worldly pleasures, but meanwhile he had his girlfriend and maybe a few children. This is exemplified in the case of Pope Innocent VIII. I've said before, when somebody calls themselves innocent, it might be a sign that he isn't. He had purchased his way into the papacy and already had several children, and had several more now that he became pope. Made it a regular practice to sell church offices to the highest bidder. We've seen that in the past. It was now coming into its own in this day and age as well. And so it's in this instance that we have the last of our pre-reformers, and this is going to be Savonarola. He is a Dominican priest in Florence, Italy, northern Italy. He preaches against the moral corruption of the clergy. He says that clergy ought to act like clergy. He says that clergy, those that are priests, those that are bishops, ought to act in a way that befits their title and their calling. He takes political control of Florence following its overthrow by Charles VIII of France. The French had come in, taken it for a time, but then had been driven out. And now Savonarola becomes the leader of the city. As such, one of the things that he condemns is the homosexual practices, making them a capital offense. It was already against the law, but it was something that was, whether it was against the law or not, was practiced both by people and probably especially by priests and clerics who, after all, were swearing a vow of celibacy. In other words, they weren't going, supposedly at least, they weren't going to be married to a wife or have a girlfriend but sometimes they would have instead a boyfriend. You put a bunch of men together, and sometimes this is what has attracted them. They also had what was known as the bonfire of the vanities. If you've walked around even modern day Florence, you see a lot of the artwork perhaps borders on what might be termed as some rather pornographic, and some of it probably had gone past what you might even see today. Some of the artwork of the Renaissance paintings, and so many people began to bring their paintings to an open bonfire and burn these things. You say, well, that's awful. Well, what they were doing is they were saying, we don't want to have that which pulls our attention from the Lord. We don't want to have pornography within our city. Instead, we want to have our city glorify Christ and have godly themes. And so there were even cases where artists themselves brought their paintings and burned them, saying, no, we've gone a bit too far in this or that. We actually want to do this in honor of Jesus Christ. Now, he's excommunicated by the Pope. Remember, the Pope is living a very secular lifestyle, and so he doesn't want anybody calling clergy to live holy lifestyles, because that is an affront to the type of lifestyle that he is living. And so Savonarola is arrested. He is tortured on the rack until he signs a confession. And now that he has signed the confession, he's going to be burned at the stake. If you go to Florence today, out in front, and I don't remember the name of the museum. You can see, for example, off to the side, there's a number of statues. The statue that's closest to you, about 30 feet out from the direction that statue is looking, you see this big plaque. I don't know if it's granite. Not actually sure what it's made of. It looks like granite, but it's set into the very stone of the city square that commemorates, that says this is the place where Savonarola was burned at the stake, as he stood up for Christ, as he stood against the lack of godliness in the church of his day, and so this is a memorial to him. The Roman Catholic Church has gone there in recent times and has insisted that Florence remove the plaque, because they say we don't put plaques up to heretics. And the city of Florence has said, no, that's part of our heritage and part of our history. The plaque remains, and it's still there to this day.